Hello again, and welcome to History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and we are going to continue talking about early statehood for Louisiana. Now, what we said was that Louisiana became, pardon me, a state in the year 1812 after successfully going through the process laid out in the Northwest Ordinance for transitioning from a territory to a state. Well, Louisiana is now a state. And so it's important for us to examine the Constitution of 1812, upon which the approval of the Congress for Louisiana statehood was based. Now, it was not, and I need to stress the word not, it was not a democratic document. But those of you who are serious students of history will not be surprised to discover that. The framers of the Constitution, for example, um, were big fans of republics, but had a hearty distrust of democracy, letting the people have too much say so, letting the people have too much power, went against what most of the elites in America of that time stood for. And remember, uh, at the Constitutional Convention, 55 men worked on the United States Constitution. Only two of them were small farmers. The rest of them were merchants and bankers and lawyers and plantation owners. They were the elites of society. They really didn't think that the uh, the people had the ability to make important political decisions. And the documents, the state constitutions that they wrote as a result were in keeping with that attitude. So let me say it again. The Louisiana Constitution of 1812 was not a democratic document. And before you get all upset, let me prove that. Only white adult male property owners could hold office. So there were a number of qualifications there. You had to be white. And what does that really mean? It means that free people of color cannot hold office. They're not white. Adults, right? Today, an adult is considered to be 18 years of age. If you're 18 or older in the United States today, you can vote. Not so then. Now, each state chose what the minimum voting age was, but generally it was considered to be 21. You had to be a male, and that that absolutely knocks out half the population. Roughly half the population is female; they cannot vote. And you've got to be a property owner in order to vote. What if you are hardworking uh, and you save your money and you do all the things that you're supposed to do to be a good citizen, but you don't own property? Well, you can't vote. Sorry, Charlie. So, in order to vote, you had to be a white adult male property owner. I'm sorry, to hold office, you had to be a white adult male property owner. In order to vote, you had to be a white adult male who paid taxes. So, once again, the full benefits of citizenship are not available to many people. To hold office, white adult male property owner. To vote, white adult male citizen who paid his taxes. So, what if you were a good man in every way, but you did not own any property? You rented an apartment, right? Or you rented a farm. You didn't pay tax, therefore you were not eligible to vote. As a result, probably no more than one in every three um, Louisianians could vote. Women couldn't vote. Blacks couldn't vote. Non-taxpayers could vote. Non-property owners couldn't vote. And of those who were eligible to vote in Louisiana, only about half even bothered. So the bottom line is that Louisiana was basically controlled by a very small piece of the population. The Constitution had some serious flaws. There was no way for it to be amended. If you wanted, if somebody desired to amend the Constitution of 1812, the whole thing had to be kicked out and then rewritten. Amendments, let me say it in this language. Amendments required the rewriting of the entire document at a new constitutional convention. Those limitations made it almost impossible to amend the Constitution of 1812. And they did it that way on purpose. The elites of society liked the Constitution of 1812 just the way it was, because it eliminated much of their political competition and left the running of the state of Louisiana up to the elites. It was even difficult to call a new constitutional convention. It required a 2/3 vote in both chambers of the legislature. So was it intentionally, was it an accident at all? No, it was not an accident at all. It was done on purpose. People who have power like to keep power. It's just that simple. In fact, that might sound like an oversimplification, but very few people have ever given up power voluntarily. One of them that comes to mind immediately is George Washington, but Washington was the exception and not the rule. Now, let's talk about the let's talk about issues that deal with the governor's office of the state of Louisiana. Well, in the original, now once again, please remember this was the Constitution of 1812. The legislature chose the governor from the top two candidates. In other words, the candidates were chosen, uh, and the people voted on the list of candidates. But the final decision was made by the state legislature from the uh, two names that received the most votes. In order to be governor, you had to be 35 years of age. In order to be governor, you had to be a Louisiana resident for at least 6 years. Now, why only 6 years? Well, so many people were moving into the state of Louisiana that a lot of people hadn't been here 6 years. And so by making the residency requirement 6 years, it really meant that only the old elites were eligible to be governor, because only they had been there, and their families had been here for 6 years. You had to own $5,000 worth of taxable property. Now, $5,000 today is chump change, right? I mean, come on. We can, you as students can easily spend $5,000 just on a meal ticket and Starbucks and a muffin every day. But in 1812, $5,000 was a lot of money. If you had $5,000 in of taxable property, you were probably in the top 1/4 of Louisianians with regard to wealth. Now, once you're elected, the governor had a number of powers, including the governor got to appoint all state officials. Now, some of his appointments, before it would really go into effect, required the approval of the legislature, and some of them didn't. But no matter whether it required approval by the legislature or not, you didn't even get a hearing in front of the legislature unless the governor appointed you. And governors were limited to one 4-year term. At the end of that 4 years, you had to retire. Now, you could lay out for 4 years and run and be elected again. That's true. But you could not serve consecutive terms. It had to be non-consecutive terms. Now, what about the legislature? Well, the legislature had two chambers, the state Senate and the state House of Representatives. Let's look at the state Senate first. What were the qualifications to be elected to or to run for the Louisiana State Senate? Well, you had to have been here for 4 years. You had to be at least 27 years of age. You had to have at least $1,000 worth of taxable property. And senators served staggered 4-year terms. The governor serves 4 years, so does the Senate. Half the Senate serves, half the senators run for re-election every 2 years. That would be the easiest way to put it. In other words, not all senators run for re-election at the same time. Only half of them do. Now, if you're familiar with the way the United States Senate works today, you know that every 2 years, 1/3 of the U.S. senators run for election. So this was not a carbon copy of how the U.S. Senate did, but it was similar in how the U.S. Senate did. And originally, under the Constitution of 1812, there were 14 senators. How about the House of Representatives? Well, you had to have been a resident of Louisiana for at least 2 years. You had to be at least 21 years of age. You had to own $500 worth of taxable property. Your term of office was 2 years, and you had to run. Everybody ran at the same time every 2 years. And of course, that's the way it still is in Washington. That's the way it is here in the state of Louisiana as well. Now, originally, there were, according to the Constitution of 1812, there were 25 state representatives. Louisiana had a state court system that was in place as a result of the Constitution of 1812. We had a Supreme Court, state Supreme Court. We also had state district courts, and just as today, United States, the members of the United States Supreme Court and members of the United States District Courts served for life. So did those judges back then. You couldn't fire them except for what was referred to as cause, which means they had to be crooked, they had to be found doing something wrong that you could accuse them of, try them, and get them convicted. And if you could do that, then you could kick them off the bench. But as long as they kept their nose clean, they had a job for life. Now, the Constitution of 1812 did not say how many justices there should be on the Supreme Court. Neither did it say how many state district court justices there should be. But the first meeting of the legislature after we became a state, that legislature decided that the Supreme Court would have 5 members, and that each of the district courts would have one district judge per district. Now, there were also lower courts. We talked just then about Supreme Courts and district courts. Those are rather high level courts. There were lower level courts as well. For example, each parish had a parish judge. And as the name implies, that judge generally heard less important cases, but cases that were nevertheless important to the parish in which the crime was alleged to have occurred. Plus, justices of the peace handled minor legal matters in each parish. Today, justices of the peace still exist in Louisiana. If you want to get married and you don't want to get married in the church, you can have a civil ceremony, and quite often the justices of the peace are happy to perform those ceremonies for a couple. Also, quite often, if you get a traffic ticket, especially a speeding ticket, it's according to where the infraction takes place, but there's a good chance that you will have to go before the justice of the peace to pay your traffic fine. Now, the United States Congress approved the Louisiana Constitution, which we copied from the state of Kentucky. They approved that Constitution on April the 8th, 1812. When Louisiana came into the Union, the Florida parishes were a part of the state. Louisiana came into the Union as the 18th state of the Union, so it was the fifth state to come in addition to the original 13. And Claiborne was who had acted as the only territorial governor that the territory of Louisiana had ever had, was elected Louisiana's first state government, a governor as well. Now, very shortly after Louisiana comes into the Union, the United States declared war on England and began the War of 1812. You don't have to remember this specifically, but the declaration of war came on June 18th, 1812. Louisiana and New Orleans were both very important strategically. The Mississippi River literally not only drained about half of North America, but about half of North America sent its produce down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where it was unloaded to ocean-going vessels and then was shipped to all parts of the globe. So yes, Louisiana and New Orleans were extraordinarily important almost immediately. And of course, the British understood this. The British almost immediately blockaded the mouth of the Mississippi River in an attempt to keep anything from leaving Louisiana, going out into the Gulf of Mexico and into the rest of the world. It was also there to keep stuff from coming into Louisiana from the rest of the world as well. So it stopped imports and exports, we would say, in academic language. It brought trade with Europe and with the rest of the United States to a near halt. Now, many of the European Creoles, whether they were French Creoles or Spanish Creoles, it really didn't matter. Many of the Creoles were still opposed to becoming, they had never got over being a U.S. territory. And then almost before they could catch their breath, they discovered that they were now a United States state. And they were still opposed to all this. They'd still dreamt, especially the French, they still had these dreams of being kicked out of the United States and being made a part of France again. Many of them were convinced that New Orleans could not defend itself. Many of the Creoles simply wanted to sit the war out. And to be quite honest with you, many of them wished bad things would happen to the United States, because bad things happening to the United States might result in them being made a part of France again. Now, nevertheless, Claiborne had a duty to defend both the city and the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. Now, let me give you a more general background of the War of 1812. By 1805, Napoleon controlled almost all of Western Europe. He had invaded his neighbors and he had conquered them. But what he controlled was the land of Europe. But who controlled the oceans around Europe? Well, that's an easy question to answer. It was England. England at that time had the world's strongest economy and the world's strongest navy. So Napoleon's empire stopped at the water's edge. England controlled the sea, France controlled the land. It was just that simple. And it had, at least in 1812, when the Louisiana becomes a state, it seemed that that the two sides, England and France, had sort of settled into this tie, this stalemate that needed to be broken, but no one could figure out how to do that. Americans grew rich trading both with the English and the French. Now, if you've had me for History 201, you'll remember that as early as Washington's presidency, the United States had declared a policy of neutrality, and had announced that because they were neutral, they would not play favorites. They would not favor or disfavor England, or they would not favor or disfavor France. They would be neutral. They would trade with both sides. They would treat both sides equally. Sounds great on paper, doesn't it? And for a while, it worked. For a while, it did work. American merchants became filthy rich because they were trading with both the British and their allies, and the French and their allies, and the French and the people that the French had conquered as well. But as time passes, both the British and the French, they began to make arguments that sound very much alike. Both nations began to say that what the United States considered as being normal trade actually helped the enemy. The British said, whenever the United States trades with France, that means that France has additional assets now to fight England. And the French said the same thing. Every time the Americans traded with England, they had additional resources with which to fight France. The English began to interfere with both sides. Both sides began to interfere with American ships on the high seas. Now, let's be very careful here. I'm not talking about American naval vessels. At least I'm not talking about naval vessels yet. When I say that the British began to interfere with American vessels on the high seas, I'm talking about merchant vessels, civilian vessels, privately owned vessels who were vessels that were taking stuff to France and to France's other ports and to France's allies. Now, the French had been stopping our ships on the high seas as well, but the United States, in a treaty in 1800, had sort of come to terms with the French. The French were not totally out of the picture, but the French were not actively irritating the United States, right? It was the British who were the main culprits by 1812, the year that Louisiana becomes a state and the year in which, obviously, the War of 1812 begins. The British were stopping American ships on the high seas, and they were examining those ships. And if the cargo manifest, in other words, there was paperwork. Everything requires paperwork. Right? If the paperwork showed that the vessel and its cargo was bound for France or for one of France's allies, then the British would confiscate the cargo and sometimes actually even confiscated the ship itself. Oh, excuse me. The U.S., the people, the population of the United States was outraged by these actions on part of the British. In addition to confiscating cargoes and ships, the British began to confiscate people too. When they would stop an American ship, they would examine the crew, and if they had a suspicion that one of the crewmen of the American ship might be a deserter from the British Army or a deserter from the British Navy, they would uh, they basically would take him off the American ship, put him on the British ship, and two things then would happen to that person. Neither one was very good. One thing that could happen was that he could be executed for being absent without leave or desertion. And the second thing was he could be forced to join the British Navy. Now, the British Navy was the most powerful navy in the world at that time, but the British Navy was a brutal service. Almost every bad thing that a British sailor did had the penalty of death. It was not a wonderful thing to be a British sailor, and so for many of the American sailors, if they were pulled off their ship, many of them actually preferred death over service in the British Navy. That service was so very brutal. The American public was outraged by all of that, and many Americans demanded that we go to war with England because of their behavior. Now, the icing on the cake was there was an American ship called the Chesapeake. It was heading for Europe. Now, this was not a merchant vessel. This was a vessel of the United States Navy. All right, called the Chesapeake. It was stopped out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by a British naval vessel by the name of the Leopard, and the Leopard fired a shot across the Chesapeake's bow, which is the universal sign to stop where you are. Well, the Chesapeake stopped, and the English captain demanded that he be permitted to board the American vessel and check the cargoes and check the crew. Well, the captain of the Chesapeake refused, at which point the English captain fired his cannon into the Chesapeake and killed a number of American sailors. Well, at which point the American captain surrendered. Now, when the word of the attack by the Leopard on the Chesapeake got back to the United States, we were really outraged, and the demand to go to war intensified even more. Now, Jefferson was the president at this time. Jefferson understood that going to war with England would be the very worst thing that the United States could do, because the United States Navy was almost non existent. And this would probably be a naval war. So it probably was a war we could not win. So what Jefferson does, instead of going to war, instead of going to physical war with England, he decides to go to economic war with England. And he asks the Congress, and the Congress approves of something called the Jefferson Embargo. Now, Jefferson was convinced by this time, England has the strongest economy in the world and the strongest industrial base in the world. And one of the things that England is the best at is weaving cloth. Now, there's a fancy term for cloth. We call it a textile, right? And you make textiles in a textile mill. By this time, most of the fabric that was being created in England, where it had been wool and linen, remember our previous lectures? Instead of being wool and linen, now most of that fabric was made out of cotton. Now, most of that cotton out of which the garments were made was American cotton. Because remember, 1795, Eli Whitney or somebody had mastered the cotton gin, and the growing of cotton had really skyrocketed since 1795. So it's been, 15 or 20 years now. Jefferson's idea is that rather than fight England militarily, we should fight them economically. What he suggested was an embargo. An embargo basically is the decision to stop trading with a country. But Jefferson took the embargo a little further than that. What the Jeffersonian Embargo did, it stopped all trade between the United States and all of Europe. It affected everybody. And the idea was that since England was so dependent upon American cotton for its textile industry, and because the textile industry was such an important part of the British economy, that if they didn't have cotton fiber with which to weave cotton cloth, that they would come to us on their hands and knees, begging us to resume shipping cotton to them, and they would promise not to mess with our ships anymore. That was the plan. Now that's probably an oversimplification of the Jefferson Embargo, but that's good enough for our purposes. The problem was that in order for the Jefferson Embargo to work, required the approval of American farmers. It required some sacrifice because it would take some time after we stopped shipping cotton to England before the lack of cotton became obvious in the British mills, because they had a stockpile of cotton, and it might take them a number of months to work their way through the stockpile before they ran out and needed to be resupplied with new cotton. So Jefferson asked Americans to make a sacrifice, especially the cotton farmers. But it wasn't just the cotton farmers. In New England, one of the big industries up there was the fishing industry. Um, uh, the fish that were caught off the coast of New England were already beginning to make an impact on feeding the world, especially feeding Europe. So it wasn't just cotton that Jefferson cut off from going to Europe. How about tobacco? Tobacco was still a big deal. Um, Even though the soil conditions were reducing the amount of tobacco that could be raised on the average farm, tobacco was still a really important crop. What happened? And look, I'm an ex-smoker, and I understand what happens to you when you stop smoking cold turkey, because that's how I quit. It was not fun. If you're smoking, you want to continue to smoke. So it wasn't just cotton, tobacco, fish, and other products as well. And all of those stopped going to not just to England, but to all places around the world. And it required the cooperation of American farmers and fishermen in order to make it work. And Jefferson did not get that cooperation. From the very beginning, Americans began to complain about their financial losses. They were not willing to suffer up front in order to uh, stop the British behavior and for things to return to normal on the high seas. So the Jefferson Embargo really was a failure in that sense of the term. In the long, no, okay, so the embargo was in place about, well, a little less than a year and a half. And Jefferson, it was damaging him politically. And that's the thing that politicians dread the most, right? Is for one of your policies to damage you politically. And so the Jefferson embargo was dropped. Now, one of the ironies of American history is that if Jefferson had been able to hold on a little longer, he would have won. Because what he didn't know was that the plan was working. That British mills were running out of American cotton, and they didn't have a dependable source of cotton from anywhere else. If we had held on for just a little while longer, the British would have probably come to us begging for relief. But the Jefferson embargo was canceled before that event happened. Now, while the the Jefferson embargo, was being discussed. Now, American diplomats and British diplomats were talking back and forth all along during this time period. Trade talks were being held. Um, England put a blockade into effect. Well, England had already put a blockade into effect that kept things from leaving from New Orleans and from other American ports. And remember, most American cities at this time were on the Atlantic Ocean or on the Gulf. New Orleans is one of them, right? Charleston, Savannah, um, uh, uh, Newport, Rhode Island was one of those big ports. And then, of course, the ports that everybody knows all about New York, Boston, Philadelphia. All those ports were on, all of those cities were ports on the either the Atlantic Ocean or the uh, Gulf of Mexico. And the English had blockaded all those ports. It wasn't just New Orleans that they blockaded. Well, as a result of the Jefferson embargo, but we didn't know it. You see, that's the thing about it. Remember, let me say this again, communication could only be as fast as the fastest transportation. If computers and telegraph and telephone and all that stuff had existed in 1812, we probably never would have fought the War of 1812 because we would have had instant communication. When the British government realized that they were being damaged by the Jefferson embargo, they would have made these diplomats would have made that known, and they would have tried to resolve that problem. But back in those days, remember, it takes 2 months or so to cross the Atlantic Ocean and 2 months for a word to get back. And so 4, 5, 6 months it took to make the round trip instead of instantaneous like it is today. Well, in any case, England, who had been damaged by the Jefferson embargo, but we didn't know it. So what the English do, they stop the blockade of American ports. So we've won, but we don't know it. We don't know it. England, now pay attention to these dates, and this will make it very clear to you the truth of what I've been saying about the fastest communication is dependent upon the fastest transportation. England revokes the blockade on June 16th, 1812. Now, if this had been a modern day with modern communication, the United States would have discovered that immediately, wouldn't they? Instantly. But we didn't. The United States declares war on England on June 18th, 2 days since the English canceled the blockade. If communication had been instant, the United States would have said, "Oh, thank you. That's what we wanted you to do all along. Let's kiss and make up. Let's have a hug." But that didn't happen because we didn't know about it. We declared war on England without knowing that they had canceled the blockade. And to be quite honest with you, a lot of Americans wanted war with England. Okay, and under any, in nevertheless, we are at war with England now. The British have three military goals. There are three things that they think should happen in order for England to defeat the United States in what we now call the War of 1812. First of all, remember, Canada is owned by England. Canada has been owned by England since the end of the French and Indian War that ended in 1763. There are British soldiers in Canada already. And so the British make plans to invade the United States, the northeastern part of the United States, um, through Canada. And the goal was to separate New England from the rest of the United States. Why? Well, New England, although America was far from being a super powerful industrialized nation yet, what industry we had was located in New England. And so, by severing New England from the rest of the country, the British could deprive the United States of the industrial goods that were being made in New England. They also, there were, uh, that's the first of the three-part plan. All right. The second part of the plan was to reinstate a blockade of American cities along the Atlantic because these port places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York and Charleston and Savannah, those were so very important to the American economy that if a lot of what we exported went out through those ports, of course, in addition to New Orleans, and they came into the country through those ports as well as through New Orleans. So we're going to let the import and exports from those cities just dry up and die on the vine. The third of the strategies is to capture the city of New Orleans. New Orleans at that point was probably the second largest port in the entire United States. Even though we were a brand spanking new city, we were now a part of the United States. And so much went in and came out of New Orleans that it was absolutely critical to capture New Orleans and make it and stop all of that trade from happening because it would go a long way to crippling the economy of the United States. Now, number one and number two were unsuccessful. Okay. And that left only option number three. Now, we're not going to go into why options number one and number two were unsuccessful. It's enough for us to know that they were unsuccessful. And that leaves, and now we're back in Louisiana history, though, aren't we? It leaves number three, the capture, the seizure of the city of New Orleans. Now, we all know, most of us who are from, especially those of us who are from the state of Louisiana, and most of us, no matter where we're from, we have a basic grasp of what happened at the Battle of New Orleans. But let me give you some deeper background. We all know that Andrew Jackson is the hero of New Orleans. The park right in front of St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans was originally called the Place d'Armes, right? It was where the militia drilled in preparation for war. After the War of 1812, I can't give you an exact date, but eventually that was renamed. It was renamed. It was called Jackson Square. Uh, the centerpiece of that beautiful little park in front of the Cabildo and the Presbyterian and St. Louis Cathedral. The centerpiece of it is that magnificent statue of Jackson on that horse. Now, Jackson was in fact the hero of New Orleans, but how did he get to New Orleans? How did he become the hero of New Orleans? Well, as it turned out, Jackson was an Indian fighter. First and foremost, he was a successful Indian fighter. He was not a member of the United States Army. He was a member of the state of Tennessee militia. He was a general in the Tennessee militia. And Jackson and a number of Tennessean militia members had heard that the Indians in southern Alabama were on a rampage against the white settlers in that area. It was the Creek Indian tribe that was causing all these problems. Well, Jackson and his Tennessee militiamen. By the way, that's why the University of Tennessee teams are called the Volunteers, right? These were all volunteers into the Tennessee militia. See, there's usually a historic reason for all this stuff. They marched down to Alabama, and they, at a place called Horseshoe Bend, in Alabama, they defeat the Creek tribe. And the Creeks would never again be as powerful as they were that day because Jackson really, really punishes the Creek tribe that day. Before Jackson and his militia can return to Tennessee, though, he hears that the British Army is heading for New Orleans with the intention of conquering New Orleans, shutting down the Mississippi River. Remember, this has always been a fear. It was always a fear that the Spanish would do it. There was a fear that the French would do it. And now there's a fear that the British will do it. So Jackson marches his army across the country from southern Alabama to southern Louisiana. And what a terrible, I've never read a book that describes how difficult that journey was. But if any of you have any plan of becoming historians, that would be a great book. Now, let me give you a warning. My computer storage is almost full. I just got the little warning on my screen. Now, I have an exterior drive that I'm going to that I transfer all this stuff to. But if I don't get a chance to do that, I'm going to keep on talking. But if I stop in mid sentence, you'll know what happened. My computer has shut down, and we'll continue once I transfer some of these files over to that external drive. Okay, let's keep going fast, fast, fast. Nevertheless, Jackson and his army appear in southern Louisiana in November of 1814. Now, we call this the Battle of New Orleans, don't we? But really, if you want to be picky, this is not the Battle of New Orleans. It did not take place in New Orleans. It took place near the present day town of Chalmette, down in St. Bernard Parish. So more properly, we should refer to this as the Battle of Chalmette, but that confuses people who are not from Louisiana, so we'll keep calling it the Battle of New Orleans. The British Army, under a general by the name of Pakenham, Pakenham, who was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and was a fine soldier. The British Army has about 8,000 soldiers, and they also land south of the city of New Orleans. And Jackson and his troops are between Pakenham and his troops and the city of New Orleans. Now, Pakenham was a good soldier. He was a very methodical soldier. He liked to make sure that everything was in place before he attacked. Now, in this case, though, he was probably too cautious. He was waiting for everything to be perfect before he attacked, and that gave Jackson the opportunity to really strengthen his defenses. But finally, the British attack on the morning of January the 8th, 1815. And we all know the story of the Battle of New Orleans, how the American had their cannon in the right places, how the American riflemen were expert marksmen, how it was a foggy morning, and it was difficult for the British to know where they were as they marched toward the American fortifications. Well, most of that is true. Some of it is not. But the reality is that when the British got close to the American lines, Jackson gave the order to fire. And when he did, all hell broke loose in Chalmette. Uh, as many as 2,000 British soldiers out of the 8,000 were killed right there on the spot. 1/4 of the British army was annihilated instantly, either dead or wounded. General Pakenham was killed himself. Um, and the Americans had won the Battle of New Orleans, which kept the British from seizing New Orleans, which meant that the British would never be able to stop shipping on the Mississippi River. Now, unknown to Jackson and the participant, well, unknown to Pakenham as well, the previous December, December the 24th, Christmas Eve, the Americans and the British had been trying to, the diplomats had been trying to end the War of 1812. And on Christmas Eve of 1814, they had arrived at an agreement whereby the war would stop. This treaty was negotiated in a Belgian town of Ghent, Ghent. Um, now remember, let's go back to that idea that communication can only be as fast as the fastest transportation. The battle was fought on January the 8th. The war had come to a close on Christmas Eve. 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, had gone by. And nobody, neither Pakenham nor Jackson knew about this. And so the battle took place. But one thing is for certain, the United States victory assured everyone that the terms of the Treaty of Ghent would be followed. Now, let's play what if history for a moment. What if the British had won the Battle of New Orleans and then discovered that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, ending the war? Would they have signed it, or would they have continued the war? Would they have gone ahead and conquered New Orleans and all that that meant? Well, we're playing what if history here, and the answer is we don't know what would happen. But I suspect that the British would have seized, literally seized New Orleans. They would have cut off commerce on the Mississippi River. They would have destroyed the American economy, and they would have won the War of 1812. Now, what did the Treaty of Ghent accomplish? Well, not really much. It Each side promised that they would return any prisoners that they had captured. Both sides promised that they would return any property that they had conquered. And basically, the Treaty of Ghent took things back to where it was before the first shot was fired in the War of 1812. Now, many Americans were very proud of the fact that the Americans had defeated the British twice in about a generation and a half. As a matter of fact, many Americans then referred to this as the Second American Revolution. The fact is that after the War of 1812, the United States has, since then, the United States has never had a more faithful ally than England. Now, we've had disagreements over the years. Don't go home and tell your mom and daddy that I said we haven't had any disagreements, but we have never shot at each other again. Okay? We can depend on the British government when we can depend on nobody else. It seems that both sides, as a result of the War of 1812, decided to have a big group hug and kiss and make up and never fight again. Okay, it didn't shut down automatically. I'm going to go ahead and end it just a few minutes early. And that, remember, was lecture number 6. And the next time I see you will be with lecture number 7. And until then, good night.